I really am thrilled that the posters are such a success, but please amazing that I think we're actually going to begin on time. So welcome back to the subcable PTC'20 subcable workshop. My name is Elaine Stafford. I have the real pleasure of moderating this second panel today with all of the individuals that probably don't even need an introduction here to my left, but I will introduce them momentarily. Before I do that, like always, I want to make a few introductory comments, and I hope you'll forgive a little bit of a personal overtone to this morning's introduction. I'd like to start off by saying Happy New Year, Happy 2020 to all of you, and especially those of you who will be celebrating Chinese New Year's this week. 2020 is a magic number, not only for PTC, but probably, I don't know what's going on here, but probably for a lot of us. Maybe it caused some time for personal reflections backwards in terms of what we've done with our lives over the last many decades. Many of us in the audience have been working for several decades. I won't ask you to raise your hands on cables that have connected the globe across the world. Besides looking backwards, we can look forwards, and that's a little bit of what we did at the last panel with Sean leading a discussion about all the new cables that are being built. At the same time, it's an opportunity to pause and reflect and be thankful. So Tony, I won't say stole my thunder, but I wanted to say thank you to the presenters of the posters, especially the Suboptic Working Group members who put together these posters and are taking the initiative to lead cross-industry teams in trying to help this industry move forward. This is another initiative by Suboptic as the organization moves forward in its quest to do more than sponsor a conference every 3 years and to do more to help the industry as a whole. So a special thank you to the Suboptic Working Group teams and poster presenters today, as well as the other poster presenters. And I also want to say thank you to Suboptic for sponsoring today's event and providing us a lunch. The cake is a test. You're not supposed to eat it until after lunch. Unless we bore you and you need a sugar high to get through it. And I doubt with these panelists that's going to happen. So I also plan to thank Tony and Paul, which is why their picture is up here on my version of the slide, despite the fact that they're not on the panel, because like both of them, I know that they appreciate the teamwork, and I appreciate the teamwork in pulling today together. But moving on beyond the personal note of thanks, looking forward and looking backward, I can't help but reflect that there were comments about bankruptcies and those being natural. Nigel did a nice way of spinning that, and I still believe, like you've heard me speak at other conferences, that the industry is on an upswing in terms of cable supply and demand. But as consultants, DRG often gets asked, what is really driving the demand that drives the cable? And we all know that the cable market historically has been quite cyclical. The current cycle, or whatever it is, a plateau or whatever, is quite long and quite large in comparison to the past ones, except the one that we don't like to remember 20 years ago. But the demand that fueled that, the capacity demand, which undoubtedly telegeography will talk about later this afternoon, has been steady state. It's not cyclical. It has been growing at a consistent rate of 30, 40, 50%, depending on what route you're talking about, over time. And when DRG gets asked by various investors, including people who are up here on this panel, about investing in a new cable or investing in the market, they can't help but ask the question, is that capacity demand going to continue? And what is really physically driving it? And not many I shouldn't say it this way, but I will say it that way. As a consultant, I don't have that answer. And I like to have answers to all the questions people ask me, but that one I don't have an answer to. And we go to telegeography, and they have a vague answer. And we go to our friends in the service industries, whether it's one of the OTTs or whether it's, a carrier, whomever, and we ask the same question. And most of the network people either choose not to answer that question or can't answer it either, because it's a very abstract thing. How is all this data being generated? How is it going between data centers, and what's really driving it? So when DRG gets asked this question, we revert to looking at historical trends. And we pull out the data from the last 20 years, and we show this consistent trend upwards. And we reflect that all the way back to when we were working on systems like TAT8 in the 80s, we would say the next one's not going to be built for another 10 years because the demand can't possibly keep growing at the rate it's growing. It can't possibly need another cable sooner. Yet invariably, the capacity demand does keep growing and growing and growing for reasons that in the current time frame we can't explain. Because the way I think of it is our imaginations aren't limitless in imagining what might happen 5 years or 10 years from now. And that's why it's so hard to forecast into the future. So now this is where I'm going to get a little bit personal, and forgive me for being a woman and doing things that women do that I know you men would love to do, but you don't dare do on stage. 2020 is a great year for me too, because some of you know that I had my first grandson born hours before I left for the airport. And like any good grandma, I love pictures of babies, and I love to show off pictures of my grandchildren. And as I was snapping pictures on my phone in the hospital before going home to pack, my granddaughter, my only other grandchild, who's 2.5 years old, grabbed my phone. And she started doing things with my phone that I don't even know how to do. Now, I know you guys have probably all had similar experience with your kids if they're 10, if they're 15, or maybe even if they're 20. But they are so agile with technology, and their imaginations are unbounded by the practical constraints that we impose on ourselves because we've lived through, I don't want to tell you how many years, it's a magic year for me this year, but lived through all these things about you can't do it because there's practical limitations. So it's our kids in the future that are going to create those applications, those services that are going to keep fueling the demand. And I can't explain it. And I'd love for somebody in the audience to explain it if they could explain it. I challenge anybody in the audience to explain it if they could explain it. But I think history proves that somebody will invent something which none of us can imagine right now. So with that in mind, with the help of my fellow panelists, I'm going to take a little bit of a journey. This is the future. These are the children, the families that we're working towards to build the infrastructure so that they can create what's coming around next. The cables that we're building are going to provide the infrastructure for unimaginable new services powered by the creativity of our families and your families from around the globe. And the panel here today is to talk about how small markets and large markets can collaborate together to provide efficient solutions to reach the world at large and to unleash the power of all of these imaginations of individuals and children that are here to come that we've never met, but right now don't have access to the internet. And my hat's off to many of the individuals standing here or sitting here next to me who have worked hard to plan and negotiate cables that not only connect the big data centers between hubs, but on the way, as they pass by, they find a way to work with the small island nations or the countries along the continental edge to connect countries that don't have all of the access that we have. So forgive me for being a little bit sentimental, but when I look back at 20 years, backwards over the decades that I've been in this business, and I think about what I've accomplished, I think it's the same thing that a lot of you have accomplished. You've managed to bring the globe closer together in ways that is really important, especially in today's chaos all around. We talk about geopolitics and all that kind of stuff. Nigel made a comment about cables enabling video conferencing or whatever so that we don't have to fly all over the place. But they also bring people closer together so we understand each other better. And that's what I think we all have to celebrate. And that's in part, I know everybody's motivated by money. There's no question about it. These big companies, you know, and small companies too. We want to make money. But there's a bigger thing going on here. So that's my emotional grandma-ish thing for this morning. And I hope you'll forgive me for doing it. But our panel this morning is me, Elaine Stafford from DRG Undersea Consulting, Philippe Dumont and his family, his 3 kids and his wife, who used to be the head of ASN, now doing Elelink from Portugal to Europe, connecting several islands along the way. Many of you know Ricardo or Sarah sitting at the end of the table very, very well. If you follow him on Facebook, you'll see he's the proudest father of his son that ever lived on the earth. There's pictures there all the time. We've got Fiona Beck, whose family is here, her goddaughter. John Hibbard has a whole slew of grandchildren. And Robert, who we just heard from a little bit a while ago, has a beautiful family here celebrating weddings at his time right now. And last but certainly not least is Sebesh and his daughter. And he sent me this picture with the elephant, which I think is good. I also got pictures, believe it or not, of dogs and cats and sheep when I asked for pictures of family. But I decided they didn't use the internet yet. When they automate the cat litter to go up and send a signal to your phone to say, empty the cat litter, okay, but not yet. Anyway, so today's panel is about serving small and large markets together, common challenges and cooperative solutions. And we're going to touch upon some of the timing issues, the technology issues, the financing issues, and the competition issues. And hopefully you'll walk away with an understanding that there are win-win ways that these small markets can benefit from collaboration with the big cables that are connecting data centers, and vice versa. It's not necessarily the big cables doing a favor for the small markets. It's really a win-win collaborative thing, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'd like to start perhaps with John giving us some statistics, because John and Paul and Sebesh have made a career out of connecting the South Pacific Islands, and John has put together some metrics that really give us a flavor for what can be accomplished.
Thank you, Elaine. Yes, the Pacific's certainly been an area of growth, particularly amongst the smaller nations. There are some 22 officially declared PICs, as they call them, Pacific Island countries, and by 2022, 21 of them will have cables, and the 22nd is Pitcairn Island, with 59 people and 2,000 kilometres away from anywhere, and it's not likely to get one. But the rest, it's quite amazing that we'll have 21 out of the 22 with cables by 2022. Of those 22, 15 are currently in service. There's 4 under construction, 2 are very advanced planning, so that brings up the 21. We've seen the growth. 2005, we had 4 countries had cables. By 2010, it was 10. 2015 we're up to 12, and by 2022 it'll be up to 21. And interestingly, as Elaine mentioned, passing a number of them are result of branching units. When you count up the domestic cables and the second cables for some of these places, there's some 54 cables I count that go to the Pacific Island countries. Of those, 34 involve spurs of BUs and 20 are simple point-to-point connections. So it's quite fascinating to see the use of the BU in delivering connectivity to the smaller nations throughout the Pacific. So I think that gives you a snapshot of some of the dimensions and of a region which is enormous in size, and one of the great challenges, of course, is the length means cost, and for small nations, very difficult to support, and thank heavens for the BU.
So, Subesh, could you comment then on some of the statistics about what this has done to change the landscape for IT connectivity in the islands that has been connected?
Sure, Elaine. Starting with a little bit our background. So we are part of a development organization. So our role is to connect the unconnected, as Elaine initially mentioned. So when we look at a particular small island, we always look at the affordability and the quality of the service going forward once we invested in it. Otherwise, no point of investing in a high-cost cable system which nobody can afford. So, and this kind of collaboration with big cable companies are giving us that opportunity. So it's not only connecting a particular small island, but also gives us the opportunity where no other solution would work other than the satellite. So we have done at least 2 so far, and one of them is running successfully, very successfully. It brought the initial capital cost way down than our initial estimate of an independent cable. And also we could see going forward the operating cost would be, again, below what we were estimating. The other that we are currently working on, it's in the implementation phase. Other than this kind of collaboration, there wouldn't be any possibility of a cable connection. So this is, again, something we cannot think without collaboration with a big cable company. And we are hoping with this particular implementation, we would be able to provide the affordable connectivity to one of the remotest island in the Pacific. So again, without this collaboration, in some cases, cable would not be possible at all. In other cases, it helped us to bring down the capital cost, operating cost, and also one thing we should not forget, it's not really tangible benefit, but again, these small islands are very new to the cable business, most of the cases, and they have no experience, no capacity to run a long cable. So when they collaborate with a large cable operator, this gives us the benefit to use their knowledge, use their capacity to maintain it going forward. As we all know, these cable systems are for next 25, 30 years. So unless they get that help, it would be very, very challenging for them to maintain that. So there are financial benefits, but there are also intangible benefits associated with this kind of collaboration.
Philippe, can you share some of your experience on L-Link and connecting some of the islands?
Well, it starts by, L-Link is a private cable connecting Europe to Brazil, right? So it starts by you have a nice market, but then suddenly you realize that the market is not probably paying for the cable, so you have to find other source of financing. I subscribe to your comment, John. The best way for small markets to connect is branching units. So suddenly you have L-Link trying to say, which islands are we passing by? And it happens that we were passing by Capo Verde and Madeira in particular, and we were able to put branches there and somehow contribute to the financing of the cable. And this is really how we made that happen. But the other thing is that when you CIF the cable, when you get that into force, this is not the end of the story. And if you manage this well with your supplier, you can push the design freeze as far away as you can, and you can start to engage with other islands that were basically not considering the cable before because they didn't believe into it or whatever. You know, that happens. Sometimes people wait. And if you do this, then if you're able to push the design away in your planning, then you start to think about connecting other islands. And this is why today we're trying to connect Mauritania in particular. We have a BU fronting Canary Island. We have one fronting Morocco. What I mean is that small markets, when you build a cable, they're not on, they are a true opportunity for bigger cable to make a more sound business case. It's very important. And for the small market, it's a real opportunity because a branch will cost always lower than a point-to-point connection. So it's a win-win at this stage.
So I like to say sometimes that ROADMs, like UBMs in the past or whatever, are a technological innovation that really allows cable developers to manage risk. It's a technical solution to a commercial problem. To your point, it allows deferred commitment on capacity obligations and the like. That leads into a discussion of ownership models and how, people talked about at the first panel about JVAs, which are, in large part, from my standpoint, like CNMAs, except you look at physical assets of fiber pairs instead of investment units being an investment share. But these physical assets of fiber pairs that are owned now have ROADMs assigned specifically to those fiber pairs. Would anybody like maybe Ricardo or Philippe or Fiona to share some thoughts about how the structure of ownership is a little bit different when you've got a multiplicity of potential BU landing parties hanging off of a network that's on a major route?
Perhaps if I could start. It's Fiona here. So certainly some of the things that, at least from my experience, is you've got to have a strong management company, whether you've got the management company that overall controls, particularly things like the maintenance. That's where it's not so much sort of the activations and sort of the provisioning side, it's more sort of the maintenance side that you need to have the coordination on. And that's where I think outsourcing comes into play. I think previous panels were talking about that. So having the management company, which has got strong governance, which links into outsourcing models, and particular things like agreements and benchmark and standards around power, and some of those standards I think are critical to it.
Philippe?
Well, it always depends how much money the lending party has, right? So I think the first element of your question is you got to be practical and you need to look at your customer, who he is, how much money he has, and then you start thinking about what is you going to put in place. I think that's the first thing. You have to be flexible. In our case, our lending party in the small market, they own the branch. They own the branch, it's for their own use. We don't have capacity, so technically speaking, we're not able to commercialize capacity starting in Capo Verde, just to give an example. And then after, when they reach our trunk, okay, they get a chunk of capacity. You pointed out something very important. WSS ROADM technology enables to have a very flexible pricing strategy. You can start with one wavelength, okay, because these guys don't need much at the very beginning, and you can tell them, well, wait, you'll be able to increase that capacity to 1 terabit. If you're able to do this from a technical standpoint, then you're able to make it happen in the contract you sign with them, and you're able to manage the level of money he has to put on the cable day one, and that's very important. And this is the way we have done with Elalink.
Ricardo, I know you're not at liberty to speak about specific projects, so let's get that out there right now, right? But I think, Ricardo, you do have a lot of interesting ideas and experiences on the variety of cables that you've worked on that have branches hanging off of trunk paths. Could you share a complementary view to Philippe's? Because I think it's similar but a little bit different.
Well, probably the key question that we try to understand is, okay, what is the right business model and the business approach, as well as the governance? And I could see some differences between a private cable as Elalink or a consortia cable or a joint build agreement where you have multiple parties having ownership at the fiber level. And we can be quite creative at understanding, okay, what is the right solution. Probably we would not be able to find one unique approach. But just to put some ideas on the table, okay, assuming you have an ownership at fiber level, you could have 3 or 4 parties, small islands coming together and say, okay, we all own a fire pair, and then with WSS RODAMs, as Philip has pointed, each of us owns their own fire pair in the branch, and then we all share the spectrum in the trunk. So you might end having a micro consortium that has one seat at the table, owning a full fire pair, together with other parties at the table. We could see as well, as you have mentioned before, win-win stories. Just think about you have a very large cable, 12, 14,000 kilometers, and it's a small island like 500 kilometers far away. Well, that island has no chance to be connected, but they could provide a strong benefit to that cable because they could enable a power branch into that system so you can split the powering into 2 segments. Then suddenly you have more power, you can put more fibers, you can get more capacity in your system, you can lower your unit cost. So they are contributing with a benefit to that.
Exactly.
Yeah, so again, multiple options, and it depends on its particular case. I would say the best way is have an open approach, be transparent, and just find, okay, what is the best solution for that region.
So one of the questions that goes along with that is, what is, if somebody doesn't, if small parties don't cooperate to co-fund the fiber pair, but instead they buy capacity from the cable owner that owns the trunk, there needs to be some way that they can be assured that they've got some competitive pricing moving forward. Would anybody like to talk about how that's managed?
Perhaps going back to one of my former lives, there was a segment which was on a monopoly route. And, you know, one of the things that we used to do in that system was we do what I call default pricing. So basically, essentially what you were doing is just saying there's no price competition for this particular route, but either another segment on your system had competition or another system that was similar to the one that you were on had competition, and you linked those prices. So you effectively pegged your price to another segment. And that effectively provided the segment or the area that had that was basically a monopoly with some competitive pricing. And that seemed to work. I think that, you know, when you get into I know we've sort of talked about the regulatory issues, but from a regulatory point of view, when they're looking for default competition, that was one model that I was aware of that worked quite well in terms of providing an alternative view of pricing and how you can actually sort of get some competitive tension when one doesn't actually exist.
So I'd like then to turn to John or Sebesh and have you give us, if you can, some metrics on the pricing, because I've heard stories that there have been in the past cable developers who thought that they'd build a business case for a transoceanic cable on the backs of the small island nations that were in the path, that were paying an arm and a leg, forgive me, Robert, for satellite services, and that the revenues, once they connected these smaller markets, would surely pay for that cable. But in fact, I think what's happened is as these cables come into play, the local islands have seen significant price reductions. And so, and that all ties into sometimes there are requirements, as you said, Fiona, to make sure that there's competition locally for access to that cable and competition is spurred. So, Sebesh, John, can you talk about some of those issues, please?
You want to start?
Okay, let me start. Yeah, it's important, especially when the countries are getting fund from the development organization. We need to make sure, again, I am reiterating, affordability of the service at the retail level. So if we find, okay, the pricing, what they are trying to get from this big operator is not really help them, of course, we cannot really fund that. But so far, what we experience, okay, we have different models in which case they are buying the bandwidth and they are managing it, and other cases, okay, they have to buy it as the demand grows. So there is no fixed one. But we also try to capitalize as much as possible the operating cost in terms of bandwidth capacity, in terms of IRU. So that sometimes gives us the predictability that, okay, this is the maximum cost these countries would face going forward. And of course, if it is not comparable with satellite, definitely there won't be a business case and there won't be any affordability. The situation will not change. So for us, looking at the business model and the kind of contract they are going to sign with the operating cost to give us the comfort that yes, the affordability would be reached going forward. John, anything from your end?
Yes, I think that really comes down to the mindset of the main cable provider, the one supplying the trunk, as to whether this is a revenue earning thing or something that is there to help service the community, doing the right thing by the remote locations, and where you have that, they will often configure the pricing on the trunk on an incremental basis. So they're adding extra capacity, they're adding extra wavelengths, or adding extra fibre, and they use the incremental cost of that rather than a fully allocated cost to determine the price for the islands. And basically, most of the islands I've been involved with, that's been the outcome. It's been very successful, and that's one of the reasons it becomes attractive, because they're not paying excessively for the main trunk capacity. Their main cost really is the spur, and so it works well that way. And if it continues that way, I think you'll get more and more island connections.
Philippe, did you want to add something?
I agree with John. I think, well, in the case of LA-Link, again, I can only speak for LA-Link. The pricing on the trunk has been very consistent among all the anchor customers. There was a good reason for that. A lot of them were getting financed by EIB, European Investment Bank. EIB requires a certain number of elements to be there. So first of all, if you are in that case, and I suppose EIB would be no different than other financing companies, they'll check whether the pricing of this is the same as the pricing of the other one. So you can't really mess around, and you have to be consistent and fair. I don't think you're going to, I mean, if you believe that with the islands you're going to make them pay for the entire cable, you're wrong. You're just wrong.
Okay, so I clearly asked the question, which stimulated a lot of good thought, but I was trying to ask the question not about the CapEx, but actually more about how prices for capacity to the end user have changed in the South Pacific Islands as a consequence of these new cables coming in and providing competition. And I think that's a very important story to understand. So I'm going to go back again to John and Sebesh, because I know they built a business case on the benefits to the local communities, and I'd like you to share some of those with us.
Let me start in this one. In regard to the Pacific, of course, we're in a very wide area. Satellite communication has been historically very difficult because of the vast space that's there and the global beams that have to be used. And we were talking about $2,000 per meg per month for connectivity. That was less than 10 years ago. Obviously, it's come down, but cables have come down too, and the capacity and the growth has been so dramatic that the prices have fallen. And we've seen countries where when we've implemented a cable, typically you're getting, within 2 years, it'll be 5 times the capacity it was on satellite prior to the cable. And in the case of one, for instance, Palau, we've been 2 years into since RFS, and it's now 10 times. It's gone from 400 megs, we talk megs for the islands, to 4 gigs for a 20,000 person country. So that's the sort of picture, and the consequence has been that the price has dropped from over 1,000 to now well below $100 per meg per month as a consequence. So, and that's just typical of the experiences that we've seen through lots of the Pacific Islands, that we're down, not always under 100, you can't always get that depending, but typically under 200, which basically puts you extraordinarily competitive with any of the satellites. The new satellite technologies, we'll be interested to see what Robert has about what that means for price, but by and large, we're well and truly keeping up with any developments in satellite and making cable still very cost effective.
Yeah. If I could just add to that, Let me go back to our first panel speakers when they spoke about old cable systems and now new cable systems and how they differ vastly. Well, it's almost reflective of what happened in the satellite industry. You've had the traditional geostationary satellites, which were perhaps at the end of their 15-year life, providing the kind of price points which John mentioned, $2,000, $5,000. They even went north of that, John. And when you thought about the ground segment associated with it, because it was large and expensive, built to Rolls-Royce standards, the ground segment was also extremely expensive. So now let's fast forward to the presentation I gave a little while ago. We're seeing high throughput satellite technology, which is radiating beams specifically on countries, providing a higher energy mix. That means for the ground segment, the antennas, etc., are all far smaller, less power is required to run them, so the total cost of ownership has dramatically reduced. And to give you some sense of where the prices may be now for like small trunk services, satisfying a point-to-point between a city, two cities or perhaps two islands, but down at $140, $100 a megabit now, which is clear channel, so you can contend that even further. So from many thousands of dollars, it's down now around the $100 in some cases. So depending on the application, if it's trunk, if it's cellular backhaul, if it's a ship at sea, they'll all have different price points, but it's come down into the right direction.
So, Sebastian, you had shared with us ahead of time that once these prices come down and enable the market to develop more, that it becomes imperative. Probably many of us remember, I think it was probably after the last PTC, or was it after the last SNW? There was a cable fault on one of these islands that basically took the local island out. And, you know, restoration through satellite is very important, but long-term lease contracts can be quite expensive. So restoration cables are every bit as important, if not more important, to those small island nations and smaller countries than, you know, across the Atlantic between the big cities of the US and Europe, because there's already a mesh there. But it's hard to create the finance story to back the second cable once the first cable has pulled down the prices. So, Sebastian, can you comment about how you're going to help those communities deal with that challenge? And maybe, Robert, you can pick up on your comments earlier this morning about satellites being the connectivity to the remote island beyond the main island in Palau, and, you know, the restoration vehicle with, I'll call them switch spot beams, but I know that's not what they are. Can you guys talk about that a little bit?
It was last PTC, I think Tonga cable was cut, and then it took few weeks, if not months, before it was restored. Yes, once all the countries, especially the small island countries, are connected, they are very much dependent on that only cable. And we are increasingly getting requests to fund the second cable. And this is where also this kind of cooperation with the large provider would play a significant role. But as a development organization, we are finding it difficult to justify the development aspect of a second cable. We are still struggling. There is no solution right now. From our point of view, okay, we funded the first cable because we could see the development economic impact of that immediately. But when it comes to the second cable, it's mostly for the commercial reason. The commercial entities want 24/7 high availability of the cable. So it's a difficult decision for us whether to support second cable or not to support. We are still in that dilemma. And also we have to keep in mind, if we need to fund a second cable and then the small market has to pay for the operating cost of the two cables, it might have some impact on the affordability factor. So price may go up, and that may not result into a positive outcome in terms of affordability. So I have no right now answer. We are seeing a lot of demand from the small island countries. So as of now, we are saying, you please check with your private financier if it is possible. By the way, our Asian Development Bank also has a private sector investment arm. So we are sometimes forwarding their request to them, and they would be more than willing to take it up. But again, from sovereign side, from the development point of view, we don't see the immediate need of funding a second cable. But again, situation may change. We could see the economic impact if something goes wrong with the cable, and we might change our decision. So as of now, we are not really funding any second cable right now.
So foolishly 12 months ago, I thought I'd blend in a holiday whilst I was at PTC when all hell broke loose with Tonga. And working with our partners at Spark, we were able to restore services within about 48 hours. And I think it was out for about 2 or 3 weeks. Using the satellite capacity that we had and what was, I suppose, configured at their land earth stations, we were able to stand up about 150 megabits. So that got them out of trouble. So we've been around this notion of backup disaster recovery, business continuity, whatever flashy term you want to use, several times in the Pacific. I suppose the issue when we first started having this conversation was cost. Nobody really wanted to pay for capacity to have a system configured in the case of an outage or a cable break. Nobody wants to be paying out money. Everybody wants to make a megabit earn a yield for them rather than just go to waste. So the notion of selling an insurance policy really fell on deaf ears in a lot of ways. What we also try to do is use that old rule of thumb, which was how about we just configure a satellite solution to 10% of your cable network, and what we'll do is we'll apply class of service, quality of service, and we'll strip out all of the other things like social media, and we'll just keep the critical services going until the cable's restored. So we came up with a whole bunch of pragmatic solutions. We also offered, for example, a blanket approach. As you can imagine, a satellite provides coverage across the entire Pacific, across every single island. So we approached the Pacific along the lines of, how about we have a club approach? Everybody chips in a little bit and you've got this capacity available, because a disaster won't happen everywhere at the same time. You'll be able to distribute that capacity, and satellite's great to dynamic allocation of bandwidth as well. So solutions exist, the capacity's there, and I think if there was a collective approach to the problem, that we'd have a solution ready almost immediately for the Pacific, because all of the existing earth stations and base stations all are sitting there collecting dust at the moment.
So Fiona, I haven't managed to squeeze you in too many times, and I know there was some interest, and still is interest, I believe, on your part in connecting to St. Helena, and Equiano seems to have been getting there first with their project. Can you reflect on what you've heard from the St. Helena government or anything else about being the second cable to one of these remote islands that's not yet connected?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly I think, the whole idea of connecting through the small island nations is great. For us, it ends up being like the 80-20. The small islands end up being the 20% additional add-on. And it comes down to, in particular, your route choice for us. We're going, South Atlantic Express goes South Africa to New York one way, and then South Africa to Singapore on the other way. We pass by St. Helena, Ascension, Bermuda, the Mauritius on the other side, for example. And because of the closeness to those islands, in particular St. Helena and Ascension, the governments there are still very keen to have that second cable, to sort of both the point as well, if you've got one cable coming in, do you need a second? Well, the answer we're getting from the UK government is yes, they do. And partly that comes down to price, because we are transversing so close to St. Helena, the branching unit, using sort of John's comment about incremental pricing, is relatively low, and as a consequence you can actually connect in quite cheaply with the second cable. So they also have, it's not only government strategic interests, you've got military interests, you've got other sort of commercial interests. So I think that they're perhaps a little bit more well-funded in some respects than what you're seeing in the Pacific Islands, so it's a consequence of funding. And for me, particularly with St. Helena, it's route choice that we go so close to them that it's an easy drop for us.
Thank you. I'd like to move to the issue of timing a little bit. Many of you out in the audience, like me, supporting some of my clients, struggle with projects getting completed on time and even coming into force when they were originally anticipated. And often what delays them coming into force is getting everybody that's involved in the project aligned. And there are obviously more people at play when your big cable that's just going to connect data centers and maybe has, 6 fiber pairs that are owned by individual OTTs or carriers, whomever, and one that maybe is shared or sold to a customer for a group of smaller island nations or coastal nations. And managing the push to get it over the finish line when you've got more parties involved is a challenge. So I'd like Ricardo to comment on how you see this. Was there a chicken and an egg? Was it the big guys, the little guys, all of the above? Did doing something on some of the projects that you've been working on, was it the small guys that held you up, or really is it win-win? Do you see the whole opportunity to partner with smaller landing countries as a win-win for Facebook?
So before I answer this tough question, coming back to the previous point, I wanted to raise the question to the public in general is, are we addressing this issue of the second cable in those countries in the proper way? Just as we speak, West Africa is suffering a critical situation where there's 2 cables cuts, and in fact are 3 cuts. And there was a repair plant on the 3rd cable that magically they managed to stop. Otherwise, all West Africa would have lost all that connectivity. Now there's only 1 cable up in West Africa. Some of the small countries that only afforded 1 connection, and they are out. The question, and I'm talking to those guys, they tell you, okay, if we lose the connectivity, we have done our own analysis, and this is going to cost us X million a day to the country. So the question is, are we talking to the right parties when it comes to the second connection or the 3rd connection? Are people realizing once they lose the connectivity, how much losses the country is making? Because if you put together all those losses, you could your second cable be funded in just a matter of weeks. So I believe it's more us educating the people that get nervous and in panic when they lose the connectivity, that they have to fund in, I don't know, a certain way those connectivity, because this is critical for the country itself, for the global economy, for education, for healthcare. I believe this is a point that I don't know if we are addressing in the proper way. I've been talking about, well, the business case, the money, but look at the loss that you are making as a country if you lose all that connectivity that you are getting today. And I believe we should look at, the impact in the global economy of West Africa of this fiber cut, and, how many millions of dollars might be lost within the next 2-3 weeks.
I think it's a really good point, and one of the things that I think it was a while back, Riguchi's study, which was basically saying, if you lose the critical infrastructure, what does that mean from a critical piece in terms of the global money that you lose as a country? And those are the war stories that you actually really need. You need the Tonga war story, you need the West Africa war story, because when you're trying to sort of pitch that 2nd or 3rd cable, those are the things that matter, and it's hard to get your hands around what it is, because no one wants to speak up about, what went down. So it is hard to get that information, but those are the stories you need.
Well, so we are detracting from the question, which is wonderful.
No, I'm happy to answer that question, no problem.
Yeah, well, in a minute, Ricardo, because I want to get to my question, and Sebastian and I spent a long time talking about this as we planned. On the slide that I've got here, I wrote lessons learned. And the discussion, Sebastian, I'm sure you remember, and I think I also had it with John when we were talking about the panel, was there's so much knowledge inside of the people sitting up here on the panel who have done it, and several of you out there, that's not written down. If I recall correctly, Fiona, the Riguchi study from, 6 years, 9 years ago, quite a while ago, it was quite sheltered and not well known, and not, I don't think, well distributed. and probably a lot of us looked askance at us that are the old, whatever we want to call ourselves in the industry. So my question to Sebesh was, is there an opportunity? And I'm on the Suboptic EC, and I wholly endorse all the working groups, and I think it would be great if Suboptic did more, but should we have another study or a working group in the industry to share all this knowledge, the things that you just talked about, and how do we organize that so that in places that need the second cable, there's a reference point? Because I know as a consultant, when I've gotten called up and said, does it make sense to build a cable to Easter Island? I reach out to Paul, or I reach out to John and say, tell me if you, because we do business cases for big cables as DRG, but rarely do we do them for business cases that rely on the benefit in terms of the socioeconomic benefit to the country that's first connected or second connected. And that knowledge is in a few of your heads. And is there a way, I know you guys have been on a quest forever to help this part of the world. Is there a way that knowledge can be shared at a high level with metrics so that other people can benefit from the future and don't have to dig around and try and reinvent the wheel?
Yeah.
That was a question for you, Sebesh.
Okay.
Yeah, as we discussed, yes, we have a plan to come up with a knowledge product. We call it knowledge product, so that we see the impact of the first cable and then can create a business case of the second cable, and also what are the possible options available. For example, today we are discussing about this cooperative solution. I feel for small island countries, especially in the Pacific, this is going to play a critical role for the second cable. Because first cable, okay, you can get the capital costs, OPEX, or everything clear. But the next one, you have to really make sure it's not going to be a burden going forward, because your demand is not going to grow to support a second cable like in 100%. You might be using second cable maybe less than 1%, but you have to still pay for the operating cost. So if you can reduce the cost connecting to a passing by cable, that would really, really help you to manage your costing. So yes, we would be coming up with a knowledge product very soon. I cannot give you the timing right now. We actually was waiting for a few of the cables to become operational so that we have some data on our hand before we can come up with the knowledge product. Otherwise, it would be only based on theory. So very soon you would be seeing something coming out from our end, and of course, as our all our knowledge product, it would be publicly available to all of you.
And perhaps, being past president of Suboptic, I wholly endorse that what we need is some sort of standardized knowledge tools. And whether, I know there was one done on standard contracts, and those sorts of things are what small island nations need. They need to know, well, what is the industry best practice? What is standard in this industry, so that they're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Other ones are the things to do with outsourcing. We're talking about sort of the whole of life of the project, not just the installation, and how do you manage the whole of life of the project and the outsourcing associated with it. The one I dearly love is the 101 of submarine cables for financiers, because the number of times I've talked to them about submarine versus satellite, and what is a submarine and what is an IRU and how does it work and what can you expect in terms of MOUs, and no, you're not going to get the pre-sales that are completely signed up, they're going to look like this. Getting financing is really tough, particularly for those organisations that aren't used to this type of, what they're trying to find is the classic concession annuity stream. So those are a 101 for financiers, a model on outsourcing. I think the war stories and lessons learned from the war stories and how you can sort of do the cost economics back to that in terms of, the country's impact. Those would be three that jump out, and Suboptic is ideally positioned to come up with those working groups, and I encourage everyone to participate. You can't just be a passive person in this industry, you've got to actually step up to the plate, so get out there and volunteer.
Thank you, Fiona. So Ricardo, back to timing. Did having all those extra landing parties, I don't know how many they are because this project is super secret, but did they slow you down or did they help facilitate the project come to closure?
It's a matter of, okay, you want to run fast, decide things that only serve your own interest, or you want to take the time to sit down and partner with others, understand what are their needs, get all the good contribution of the knowledge they have, and build a system that will really serve the community for the next 20 years, or you want just to dictate how it has to serve the community. I believe those are two different approaches. Both are valid, and it depends on, well, each company, which approach they want to follow. I would say on the long term, it pays off to sit down and create the trust, build the relationship, and work together in an open and transparent way with your partners.
Philippe, could you comment, because you talked about your island nations coming after the fact as much as before?
Yeah, I think coming after the fact, so to speak, requires one specific element in the cable. It's a BU, a branching unit. So if you don't have the branching unit, you will never be able to connect the small markets afterwards. Well, that's a basic. But if you are a cable, whether in consortium or in private, you need to plan for a branching unit rightly placed, and you need to have money for that, okay? Well, that's the basic level one. The level two is how you finance this bunch of branching units. And it's true in the case of Elaling that we have been able to, as I said before, we have been able to push the design freeze as far as possible into the planning of the construction, into the plan, in order to understand which BUs we were needing. You know, sometimes you say, well, at this BU there is a good opportunity for business coming in the future, this one not, etc. The localization of the branching unit and the route of the trunk is also a very big element of the costs. So I think the way we've looked at it is that put as much branching unit as we could, and as well placed as we could with the knowledge we have of the market we serve. Of course, that's the first element you need.
Just Elaine, I might just add a comment that in regard, the stub BU is really a feature that, as Philippe said, is a key element, and it's certainly a way. And many of the islands have looked at stub BUs because their financing time can take longer than the main cable. They're not ready. Alternatively, they don't realise they need it till they see a big cable coming past and say, hey, it'd be great to do this, and it's too little too late. So, but the stub BU, you know, a few $1 million, they might be able to get the money together to put that in and then come back later. Sure, it costs you more to do it rather than in the main project because you've got to mobilise the ship and bring it back to do it, but it's certainly the stub BU is something that is a realistic option for many locations who have aspirations of a cable but don't quite have their finance and arrangements in place.
Very good.
So one model that we haven't talked about, but we talked about before the panel with a few of you, is that there are short, small, repeaterless or amplified systems, regional systems, that are not directly connected, not a branch off of a branching unit, that are built in the same time frame as a major cable that goes across the ocean, that take advantage of the timeline and the mobilization to save expense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been done on a number of occasions with the cooperation, I understand, I haven't been involved in these projects, of the system suppliers to give them the confidence that if there's some delay on one project or the other, they won't be responsible for the second mobilization fees. And there's some recognition of that in the supply contract and the liquidated damages clauses to give the flexibility so that these smaller places that need to piggyback on top of the big cables can do so.
Absolutely.
Is there somebody here on the panel who would like to talk for just a couple minutes about that? John,
Well,
that was a cue for you.
Oh, was it? Oh, right. Well, certainly there are, just picking up on what I was saying before, really the issue is in getting the timing right, getting the flexibility out of the suppliers, but you're talking in the case of small point-to-point systems, obviously they're really very dependent on getting your financing, and it can take a long while from when your contract is signed to when you go to CIF. In some cases I've known years, many years. And that's one of the issues, and as long as the supplier still has a slot left in a manufacturing profile and you can get in when you actually get the money and not have to sit around for a long while after that, okay, but it is one of the challenges, and but there's certainly got to be some flexibility by the suppliers in that regard, and by and large most of them have been, because they know a job's a job and they want to get it, and as a consequence they're tolerant of the extended periods, but if not slightly irritated by the delays.
Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left, and somebody out there might give me the eagle eye. I guess it's back at me, I guess. So I'd like to wrap up and start with Philippe and go down the panel and ask them to talk about how they see this win-win scenario of the collaboration and what single piece of advice they'd give anybody who's trying to manage a project that does have an element of a major trunk route connecting data centers or whatever, and little islands or countries along the way that they want to pull into the project.
One advice?
One advice.
Put stop BU.
Oh, that was too easy, Philippe.
Yeah, well, I
Come
did.
on, something profound.
Okay, politically correct. Yeah, I have my sticker here. Okay, the question was what piece of advice to put on board small markets when you do bigger cable? Is that what it is?
Not on small markets, maybe on you if you're the big cable developer. What's the most important thing to remember? What's the most important thing to do to make this a win-win success? Skip Philippe.
yes.
Go to the next one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Elaine. John?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you, John.
Get obviously watch what's happening, but get in early in your discussions with the main trunk, because we can the main trunk route can be modified to shorten the branching unit, the branch. Unrepeated branches are a whole lot cheaper and easier to implement than repeated branches. So if you can get the main cable coming within 50, 80 kilometres of the land, you can get an unrepeated spur a whole lot cheaper than having one that's 300 kilometres or 200 kilometres that need repeaters. You don't need the power feed. It's just so much simpler for everybody. The main trunk, it's simpler in their design, and it's also simpler for the branch. And we've seen some great examples. I mean, we saw Manitoua had a talk about that. They cut, basically, they had 1,200 kilometres of repeated branches in the original design when it went straight from Tahiti to Samoa. When they went down through the Cook Islands, they got all unrepeated branches. It took 500 kilometres more on the main cable, but they basically got rid of 1,200 kilometres of repeated branches. A beautiful example of where getting in early in the planning process and talk in those terms to the main trunk provider that it's not much of a deviation, and they can help an awful lot of the passing islands.
Fiona, we're going to interrupt you because Philippe has had a brainstorm.
Yes, the light has come. Fiona. Yeah, something important. When you want a small market, small island to come on board, they just don't need just a branch. What they need is a full package. So you need to help them on everything. Technical, commercial, and financing. They don't have the money, or if they have the money, you have to go get it from EIB or whoever else. They do need a lot of support, and if you want to bring them on board, you got to help them a lot. And
Okay, thank you.
My turn.
thank you.
Yes, Fiona, your turn.
Good,
Fiona?
good job, good job.
Yeah, thank you.
So, to sort of echo on some of those points, really reliable partners, choose people that have got good, strong governance, that are reliable, that you can trust, that you will know will be there for a generation, not just a transaction. And, things like, for the South Atlantic Express, it's, we've got TI Sparkle, we've got Aquacoms, we've got some other carriers in Asia and India. So it's about having reliable partners that also can see the bigger picture. And the other thing I would also highlight is, and this is probably a little bit of a plug, ensuring that you get government and bringing government on board early, and getting governments to think about submarine cables and a critical infrastructure role. And that's sort of something that I know Bermuda's done a lot of thinking about, and I'm speaking on that tomorrow about how you can have a 60-day permitting and licensing approach, unlike the comment you've been saying, Kent, in terms of landing a submarine cable into Bermuda, and that's about putting in things like cable protection zones. Talking to that tomorrow.
Thank you, Fiona. Robert, I'm waiting with bated breath.
Elaine, have I your permission to be a little bit contentious?
Please do.
Okay, just a
Please
little
do.
I think that overwhelmingly I see industries operating in their own silos, their own buckets. I think that we can't do that in the Pacific. I feel that there must be a higher level of cooperation. To give you an example, when we spoke earlier about recovery of cable systems which are torn up or what have you, the 15 years that I've been involved in the Pacific, I can't remember once that a cable company, submarine cable company, called me up and said, "Can you help?" It's always been the service provider screaming for a solution. And that's what I think we need to start doing, is packaging a solution. So if it's submarine cable, if it's satellite capacity, who cares when we're developing a solution for a small island or for a disaster recovery package? The submarine cable operator, confront the satellite solution. Make it a part of your toolkit to go satisfy your customer and perhaps differentiate yourself. The other thing that I would say by way of some thought leadership is, how do we lift utilisation and take advantage of the tremendous capacity which is available on these cable systems? As I said, let's collaborate and bring on those outer islands. Let's have them connected to the main cable system. Let's feed that animal. And the last thing I'd say is, let's start working a little bit more with the service providers, rather than just expecting to have a passive role in the relationship and have bits and gigabytes pass through our cable and satellite systems. I think we need to get more involved with them and get the pull-through of the generation of new trends emerging, SD-WAN, the cloud, 5G. Let's start working with them to pull that through our infrastructure systems. And I think it would be a great topic to add to your workshops which you're planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Sabesh?
Yeah, from development partner point of view, I think flexibility is the key, because we tend to follow template. But in this kind of situation, each instances are different. So we need to be flexible and ready to accept whichever is best for that island nation in terms of contracting, in terms of modeling, whether it's ownership model, whether it's IRU engagement, whatever, and also try to capitalize as much as possible the operating costs. So that will give the some kind of comfortness to the provider as well as to the small island nations. So flexibility is the key from our end.
Ricardo, you get almost the last word. I get the last word.
Well, it's hard to say because everybody has contributed with great ideas, but listening to all the parties, I could summarize. I have heard, okay, there is a lack of transparency. There are silos, as Robert has mentioned. There is lack of cooperation in the market. Everybody is doing their own thing. As Philip has mentioned, it is not a simple technological problem. It's multidisciplinary. You need to look at technology. You need to look at the business, etc. So at the end, probably is, okay, we need to probably be more open, more transparent, and look at defining a new business model that enables a sustainable business industry. Because otherwise that ecosystem is not going to survive if we end acting independently that way.
So I'd like to wrap up with a big thank you to all of these panelists, and especially to Robert for coming into the Wolves and being a newcomer to our group, and I hope you'll continue to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you all for
Thank
all
you,
of your
Elaine.
hard work and putting this together. So just by way of organization moving forward, since Tony's out there and not up here,
at noontime, it's now a break, and the Hilton is going to, PTC is going to set up the luncheon at the table during the break. At noontime, I believe Valley from Google will be coming up here and talking about the summer school that he and OSA coordinated together, and it was a stellar success. And so we're going to show a video, and they're going to talk a little bit about it while they continue to set up lunch. So I hope you will be back here about noon, and then we have the panel after that. I guess Tony wants to say something. I didn't mean to steal his thunder. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Welcome to this video tutorial on how to use the Subtel cable map. My name is Kieran Clark, lead analyst at Subtel Forum, and by the end of this video, you will have learned how to use the data center map layer to view the location and details of over 1,700 data centers around the world. Clicking any of the colored circle icons on the map will bring up details for the selected data center in the bottom left information pane. The data center layer is currently configured to display the name of the facility, the facility owner, and street address where available. As you zoom in on a specific location, the base map will change over to display a street map, allowing you to see exactly where a facility is located. If you select a feature that overlaps with others, a feature page count and navigation arrows will appear above the information pane. The data centers entry in the layers list is configured to group data centers by. Click the data centers entry in the layers list to expand the full list of facilities. It may take a few moments to load as there are over 1,700 facilities. You can also use the group filter to view data centers by city or country. Select the data centers by city group and input a city to filter the list of data centers to those in your chosen city. Select the data centers by country group and input a country to filter the list of data centers to those in your chosen country. This concludes the tutorial on how to use the data centers map layer to view the location and details of over 1,700 data centers around the world. I hope you found this useful and encourage you to make use of this tool to learn more about the submarine cable and related industries. If you have any questions or comments, let me know at kclark@subtelforum.com. I'm always looking for feedback on how to improve this map. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all tutorials for the Subtel cable map. I'll see you next time to talk about more exciting features.